Welcome to Libyth. To understand what it meant for Matsuo Bashō to walk out of Edo in 1689 and travel north for 5 months, you first have to understand the system he was walking through. Not as a backdrop, not as scenery, but as a set of forces that pressed on every body moving through the archipelago, that determined who could go where and why, that classified every person from birth into a position in a hierarchy so rigid it had been deliberately built to never move. Japan in 1689 was not simply a place with a social order. It was a social order that had been engineered as a machine for preventing change, and understanding how that machine worked, and where its stress fractures ran, and what kinds of movement it permitted and what kinds it suppressed, is the only way to understand why a poet moving through it on foot represents something more than a man taking a long walk. Authority in the Japan of Basho's time was legitimized by a fiction, and the fiction was elaborate enough and old enough that it had long since stopped feeling like a fiction to most of those living inside it. The emperor existed. The emperor had always existed, and in principle ruled Japan as a divine sovereign, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, the supreme authority of the cosmos as understood within the Shinto tradition. This lineage was unbroken, or rather, its unbrokenness was the most important political fact in the country, the one thing all competing powers agreed to affirm, because denying it would undermine the very structure of legitimacy that everyone depended on. But the emperor in 1689 did not rule. He performed rituals. He ratified documents. He existed in Kyoto, in a court of considerable ceremonial complexity, surrounded by aristocrats whose ancient ranks had survived the conversion of Japan into a military state, and he exercised almost no practical power over anything that happened outside the walls of his palace. Real authority over land, over armies, over the collection of taxes, over who lived and who died, over the shape of daily life for millions of people, resided in the Tokugawa Shogunate, which had held power since 1603 and would hold it with remarkable stability until 1868. The shogun was nominally a military commander, a title granted by the emperor, which meant the fiction could be maintained. The emperor was still supreme, the shogun merely his instrument, his general, the man to whom the divine sovereign had delegated the messy business of actual governance. But the shogun commanded every domain lord in the country. The shogun controlled the road network and the checkpoints on those roads, the permission to travel between domains, the right to conduct trade, the terms on which foreign ships could approach Japanese ports. The shogun decided what Japan traded with the outside world and with whom. The shogun appointed the governors of the imperial capital itself. The fiction of imperial supremacy underwrote an actual reality of shogunal control, and the gap between those two things, between the source of legitimacy and the seat of power, was a structural instability built into the foundation of the entire system, a crack that ran from the top to the bottom of the edifice, and that could never be fully sealed because sealing it would require acknowledging it. This gap mattered in ways that extended far beyond the relationship between Kyoto and Edo. It meant the Tokugawa were always ruling on borrowed authority. They could not simply declare themselves supreme without delegitimizing the very source of the power they were borrowing. They had to maintain the performance of being servants of a divine sovereign, while simultaneously ensuring that the divine sovereign could never actually exercise the power that performance attributed to him. The mechanisms for this were architectural as much as political. The shogunate kept the emperor in Kyoto while governing from Edo, 800 kilometers to the northeast. The imperial court was maintained, funded, hedged about with elaborate regulations that controlled its membership, its activities, its marriages, and its political ambitions. The distance was not incidental. It was the spatial expression of a political arrangement in which the source of legitimacy needed to be visible enough to legitimize and far enough away to be harmless. But the shogun also faced a more immediate structural problem, which was the domain lords, the daimyo, who controlled the actual territory of Japan. There were over 200 of them, each commanding a domain, each with his own samurai retainers, his own taxation system, his own local authority, his own castle town. The Tokugawa had defeated the rival clans militarily in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, one of the largest battles in Japanese history, in which the forces loyal to the Tokugawa founder decisively broke the power of the Western alliance opposing him. That victory was enormous, but military victory is not the same as stable governance, and the decades following Sekigahara were spent converting the fact of power into the institutions of power, building the machinery that would make the shogunal order self-perpetuating rather than merely powerful in the moment. The central instrument of this conversion was a policy known as sankin-kōtai, alternate attendance. Every domain lord was required to spend alternating years in Edo and in his home domain. When he was in his home domain, his family remained in Edo. The logic was elegant in its brutality. The daimyo could not rebel because his wife and children were in the shogun's city, subject to whatever response the shogun might choose to make. He could not accumulate the wealth necessary to mount a serious military challenge because the cost of maintaining two full households, one in his domain, one in Edo, both of them run at the scale appropriate to his rank, plus the cost of the procession that moved him and his retinue between them twice a year, consumed a significant portion of his annual income. These processions were themselves politically significant. They were regulated by rank, which meant that the daimyo had to spend exactly the amount that his rank demanded, and no less, ensuring that conspicuous consumption became a form of political loyalty. The roads of Japan in 1689 were rivers of money flowing toward Edo, bleeding the domains and enriching the center. The system was designed to make loyalty cheaper than rebellion, and it worked with remarkable effectiveness for over 2.5 centuries. The stability this produced was real, and it was in many respects extraordinary. The Edo period is one of the few extended periods in Japanese history without significant domestic warfare, without the dynastic civil conflicts and clan wars that had characterized the preceding centuries. Cities grew. Commerce expanded. Popular culture flourished in ways that would have been impossible in a less stable environment. The great cities of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became centers of a vibrant urban culture: kabuki theater, woodblock printing, popular fiction, the haiku schools of which Basho's was the most prominent. But stability purchased at the price of enforced immobility has a cost, and that cost was paid in the internal pressures that the system generated but could not release. The political tensions that ran beneath the surface of Tokugawa order were multiple and interlocking. The Neo-Confucian ideology that the shogunate promoted as official doctrine provided a framework for understanding social hierarchy as natural, virtuous, and cosmically ordained. Everyone had a place, and the virtue of each person lay in performing that place with dedication and without complaint. But this ideology was not the only framework available, and it competed with forces it could not fully absorb or neutralize. Buddhism, which had deep institutional roots in Japanese religious life, had its own understanding of suffering, hierarchy, and the relationship between the self and the social order. And that understanding was not always compatible with the Confucian model. Shinto, which was not a doctrine in any systematic sense, but rather a way of inhabiting a landscape, of recognizing the spiritual presence in rivers and mountains and trees, persisted in the daily life of commoners and aristocrats alike, providing a form of access to the sacred that did not require the mediation of any social hierarchy. Christianity had been banned and its practitioners tortured and killed, but its suppression required continuous vigilance, which is itself a measure of how much an alternative vision of authority, one that placed the individual conscience in direct relationship with a divine power that existed above and outside any earthly hierarchy, was understood to be genuinely dangerous to the social order. The Sakoku policy, the closing of Japan to almost all foreign contact, was in part a response to this danger. If no new ideas could enter, if the country could be sealed against the intellectual and spiritual currents moving through the wider world, the existing order might be preserved indefinitely. Dutch and Chinese traders were permitted at the port of Nagasaki, under strict supervision. Korean diplomatic missions were received. But no Japanese were permitted to leave, and almost no foreigners were permitted to enter, and the information about the outside world that leaked through these narrow channels was carefully controlled. The closed country was a system, admitting it was afraid of what might come in, and the very act of sealing the borders was an acknowledgement that the order inside could not survive contact with the disorder outside. Below the political structure, the social classification was formally organized into 4 tiers, a system itself borrowed from the Neo-Confucian model and adapted to Japanese conditions. At the top were the samurai, who made up perhaps 6 or 7% of the population, but held all formal political and military authority, and who were distinguished from other classes not merely by rank, but by the legal right to carry swords, a right that was definitional to their identity, and that was protected with great vigilance. Below them were the farmers, who were ranked above artisans and merchants not because they were wealthy. Most were not. Most lived in conditions of considerable hardship, but because they produced rice, which was the material basis of everything, the thing that fed people, paid taxes, measured wealth, and underwrote the entire system. Below farmers came artisans, who transformed raw materials into finished goods, who took the rice and the timber and the iron and made of them things that could be used. At the bottom of the 4 legitimate tiers came merchants, who were understood in Confucian terms as parasites. They moved value around without creating it. They profited from the labor of others. They accumulated money rather than producing the things that money represented. And their growing wealth in the 17th century was a source of profound ideological discomfort for the shogunate. Below even the 4 tiers were the outcasts, the Edo and Hinin, who performed tasks defined as ritually impure under a combination of Shinto and Buddhist understandings: butchery, tanning, the handling of corpses, execution. These groups existed in a legal limbo, formally outside the social order that nonetheless required their labor to function. They lived in segregated communities, faced restrictions on where they could travel and what they could wear and who they could marry, and occupied a position in the social imagination that reflected the anxiety of a system that needed things done that it could not officially acknowledge needing. The economic instability this structure generated was not immediately visible in the political order, where the sankin-kōtai system was working more or less as designed. It was visible in the slow, grinding mismatch between the formal hierarchy and the actual distribution of wealth. The Tokugawa order was a rice economy in which wealth was measured in koku, the amount of rice sufficient to feed one person for 1 year, and in which the samurai received stipends in rice that were fixed at amounts determined by their rank within the warrior hierarchy. Rice prices, however, were not fixed. They fluctuated with the harvest, with demand, with the complex mechanics of the commercial rice markets that had developed in Osaka. When rice prices fell, the real value of samurai stipends fell with them. When the cost of maintaining the expected lifestyle of a samurai rose, and it rose, as the commercial economy expanded and the goods available for purchase multiplied, samurai went into debt. They went into debt to moneylenders, to merchants, to the class that formally ranked below them and was supposed to serve them. The ideological insult of this was enormous, and it was not an insult felt by a few. It was structural, felt by samurai households across the country, a quiet crisis at the heart of the class that was supposed to embody the system's values. The merchant class, for its part, was accumulating real economic power while being denied political recognition, denied social respect, denied the kind of formal acknowledgement that their actual economic importance seemed to demand. The great merchant houses of Osaka and Edo operated commercial networks of enormous sophistication, provided credit to daimyo and to the shogunate itself, and understood the economy they operated in with a clarity and detail that the samurai administrators governing them often lacked. But the ideology of the state told them they were at the bottom of the legitimate social order, and the law backed up the ideology. Merchants could not carry swords, could not hold political office, could not dress above their station or eat above it or build houses that exceeded the scale appropriate to their rank. The accumulation of actual economic power and the denial of social and political recognition produced a class with energy and resources and no legitimate outlet for either. The family was the basic administrative unit of this order, and it worked as an administrative unit in part because it was designed to. The ai, the household, was not simply a collection of people related by blood. It was a legal entity, a social position, a set of obligations that ran in both directions, toward the living members of the household and toward the ancestors, whose accumulated moral weight gave the household its character and whose honor had to be maintained. The household head was responsible for the behavior of every member, and the household's rank in the social hierarchy was in principle hereditary and permanent. The son of a farmer was a farmer. The son of a merchant was a merchant. The son of a samurai was a samurai. And this inheritance was not merely social convention, but legal reality. The Confucian virtue of filial piety was the ideological glue that held the household together. The obligation to honor one's parents, to maintain the family line, to not do anything that would shame those who came before. This virtue and the ancestor veneration that accompanied it was the mechanism by which the past exerted permanent authority over the present, by which the dead governed the living, by which the social order reproduced itself across generations without requiring continuous coercion. Above the household was the domain, the han, and above the domain was the shogunate. And this nesting structure of loyalties and obligations was meant to be seamless, each level reinforcing the others, each level providing a context within which the individual understood their role and performed it. But the nesting was never entirely seamless, and the tensions that ran through it were the fault lines along which the system would eventually, very slowly, begin to crack. The interests of a samurai household in a particular domain were not always aligned with the interests of their domain lord. The interests of domain lords were not always aligned with the shogunates. And the Confucian model of harmonious hierarchy that was supposed to make all these interests naturally convergent was an ideology, which is to say a way of seeing the world that served particular interests while presenting itself as simply describing reality. The village, the mura, was where the weight of all these structures pressed most directly on daily life. Communal farming organized around the rice paddy required collective labor and collective responsibility, and the village functioned simultaneously as a unit of economic production, a unit of taxation, and a unit of social control. The shogunate taxed domains, which taxed villages, which taxed households, and the multiple layers of extraction meant that a bad harvest was not simply a personal misfortune, but a systemic crisis that rippled upward through the whole structure. Religion in the village was organized around the local Shinto shrine and the Buddhist temple, and this combination, the shrine marking the sacredness of the local landscape and the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, the temple managing death and the ancestors and the afterlife, gave each community a form of spiritual coherence that was independent of, and sometimes in quiet tension with, the formal ideology of the centralized state. The pilgrimage routes that connected shrines and temples across Japan were, within this context, something unusual. Corridors of sanctioned movement in a system that generally preferred everyone to stay where they were. Japan had a robust tradition of religious pilgrimage to the great shrines of Ise, to the 88 temples of Shikoku associated with the monk Kobo Daishi, to the mountain temples and sacred peaks of the Northeast. To go on pilgrimage was to have a reason to move, endorsed by religious authority, that the shogunate could not easily prohibit without undermining the very religious legitimacy that helped keep people compliant. Pilgrims moved through checkpoints on the roads, with documents certifying their religious purpose. They were fed and sheltered by communities that accumulated merit by hosting them. They moved across domain boundaries that would otherwise have required permissions and documents and official reason. The pilgrimage routes were the one system of circulation that the locked box society of Tokugawa Japan permitted to function more or less freely. This is where Basho enters the picture, and this is why his freedom of movement across a rigidly controlled landscape is neither incidental to the text nor simply personal. He traveled as a poet and as something approaching a pilgrim, a figure whose movement was culturally sanctioned, whose presence was welcomed by hosts who understood that hosting a famous poet was a form of social honor that transcended the normal hierarchies, whose crossings of domain boundaries were tolerated in ways that the movement of ordinary travelers would not have been. He carried letters of introduction from his students, who had networks across the country, and these letters opened doors that would otherwise have been closed. He was recognized at Nikko, at the temples of the north, at the courts of domain lords who wanted to be associated with the greatest living poet of the age. The poet's social position gave him a form of permission that no amount of wealth or samurai rank could have provided. Because the poet moved in a register the formal hierarchy had not quite managed to contain. A register associated with the sacred, with the classical literary tradition, with the kind of cultural prestige that the ruling class needed to demonstrate it, appreciated even as it constrained everything else. What Basho was doing in the north was not, therefore, a simple act of artistic independence from the social order. It was a very particular kind of movement through a very particular kind of structure, made possible by the specific cracks in a system that claimed to have no cracks. The poem and the pilgrimage were the only socially sanctioned forms of freedom available in Tokugawa Japan, and Basho used both of them simultaneously, moving through a world of locked hierarchies and fixed positions with the ease of someone who had found, almost by accident, the one door that the system had left unlocked. And the text he produced from that movement is, among other things, a record of what you can see when you move freely through a world that was not designed to be seen freely. The ruins beneath the order, the wildness beneath the control, the permanent beneath the permanent seeming. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.